Oh, what's up everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and on this episode of Coding with the Force, I'm going to show you how to use asynchronous change event triggers in Salesforce. Okay guys, so real quick before we start this video, I'm sorry that my audio isn't as perfect as it normally is. I guess one of my children decided to mess with my mic and I didn't check it before I started recording. So it's not horrible, but it's not perfect. I'm sorry. All right, everybody. So just like with every other video I do, I first want to explain why you would care to use what I'm about to show you how to use today, which is asynchronous change event triggers. So if you don't, real quick, if you don't know what asynchronous means, let me give you a couple examples. Asynchronous basically means that you are allowing two processes to operate at the exact same point in time, whereas synchronous means that you're wanting processes to occur in steps. So for instance, whenever you insert a new account into your Salesforce account object, so you're inserting a new account record into the account object, you do synchronous steps. You do the before insert trigger first, then you would do, validation rules among a couple other things, and then you would do the after portion of the trigger, and then you would do a whole bunch of other things like workflows, process builders, and those would all occur in steps. One can't happen before the other. You do the before trigger, then the validation rules operate, then the after trigger operates, then eventually you get to the process builder and it operates, or things along those lines. So that's what an asynchronous process, that's what a synchronous process is. An asynchronous process is saying, okay, I know that this trigger is running, but also have this process run right now. So don't wait for all these other things to be done. Let's set up, another process and have it run in parallel or at the exact same time as this one that is currently operating. So asynchronous just means that you're okay with process A and B operating at the exact same time instead of saying A has to operate before B operates. That's all asynchronous is. Not super complicated, but it's a little bit of a confusing word if you've never heard of it or you're not familiar with it. Okay, now that we've got through what asynchronous is, why would you care to use asynchronous change event triggers on your objects in Salesforce? I gotta say, first, I'm doing this video more because I've received a handful of requests to do it than I am doing it because I think it's an extremely useful feature in Salesforce. Unfortunately, change event asynchronous triggers are not super useful. There are a couple of theoretical scenarios that you could use these in that could be beneficial, but let me tell you first why I think you really gotta consider other asynchronous options like queuables or futures or batchables before you get yourself into asynchronous change event triggers. So normally with asynchronous Apex, you get increased limits. So if you didn't know, for normal Apex that operates synchronously, you have up to 10 seconds to make that synchronous transaction work for you. But for most of the more popular asynchronous methods like queuables or futures or batchables or whatever, you get I think platform events adhere to this too, but I need to double check that, so maybe don't quote me on it. You get 60 seconds to operate instead of 10. So and on top of that, you get increased DML limits, SOQL limits, a bunch of other stuff. So you get increased limits for most asynchronous processing, but you do not with change event asynchronous triggers. So you've got to be aware of that. Unfortunately, no limits increase with them. The second thing is, unlike normal triggers, which if you didn't know, normal triggers always operate in batches of 200. So say you're updating 1,000 accounts through the data loader. If you didn't know, that's going to invoke your normal trigger 5 times in a batch, one batch of 200, then another batch of 200, then another batch of 200, etc. Unlike normal triggers that operate in batches of 200, change event triggers operate in batches of 2,000. So not only do you not get an increased amount of processing time for your asynchronous transaction with change event triggers, but your batch size by default is 2,000. So you've really got to be aware of that, because that can get really dangerous for large transactions, considering your processing time isn't increased. The third reason that change event asynchronous triggers are somewhat not great is because they operate as the automated system user. So if you have these on your different objects and you have them making updates to things, what you're going to see is that the created by field or the last modified by field is going to end up being updated by the automated system user. Now, there are ways to bypass that, but let me tell you, they are not fun to do, and they are very difficult. They're almost not worth it at all, except for in extreme scenarios. I do plan to cover that eventually, but not today. This does not warrant it. Okay. And the fourth thing you need to be aware of is that, say you have an account trigger, and you also have an account change event trigger. And in the account change event trigger, you want to update your accounts again. Well, you've got to make sure that you're turning off your account change event trigger. I guess really the regular account trigger is irrelevant in this. We'll just say you've got an account change event trigger, and you want to make an update to an account in the account change event trigger. Well, that's cool, but be aware that that's going to re-invoke your change event trigger because you're making a change on an account. So it's going to rerun the trigger. So you've got to make sure you have a way to shut that trigger off if you're going to do those operations. And the last thing is that because it's a trigger, you cannot make callouts. So lots of people use asynchronous processing to do callouts to external systems. There's really you really should never do that with change event triggers. Number one, you literally can't because it's a trigger and Salesforce won't allow it. So yeah, you're kind of you can't do it, which is a little detrimental. Now, I do have a couple of use cases for change event triggers. They're not all a loss, but there's just not a lot of reason to necessarily use them over your other asynchronous processing options. So one scenario that you could theoretically benefit from a change event trigger is, say theoretically you're creating accounts, and every time you create an account, you want to create a couple of tasks to append to that account. And your account trigger is already running kind of long, and it doesn't really matter whether or not your tasks are made the instant that you update an account, that you insert an account. It just matters that they show up eventually and get assigned to the right people. Well, you could theoretically take that out of your regular account trigger and put it in your change event asynchronous trigger. Saves yourself a little bit of processing time. That's probably not going to be super crazy, even in batches of 2,000. So, you're probably not going to run into any limits there unless you're doing something wild. So that's one good use case. You could maybe pull out some things, some more strenuous processes from your normal trigger and put it in your change event trigger to get things done, or to kind of, like separate the operations out a little bit and save yourself some time. Okay, the second scenario that I have thought it could be useful in any way. I can't say that I've actually used this because I've never personally had the need in any of the orgs, and I've worked in some pretty enormous orgs. But you could theoretically run out of batchable invocations for a trigger. Or maybe you run out of queuable invocations or future or something like that. For some reason, you've done something or need to do something to where, you've reached the max amount of batch initializations you can do in one transaction, or you've reached the amount of max queuables you can do in one transaction. You could extend those capabilities by using a change event asynchronous trigger. So you could go over to that other trigger and start invoking even more batch processes from it, or more queuable processes from it, etc. So in those two scenarios, those are the biggest theoretical scenarios that I see change data capture or change event asynchronous triggers being useful to you. Okay. That was a lot of an explanation. These are not really that hard to set up. But I'm going to go over a handful of things, so let's get to it. All right, so the first thing that you need to do to set up an asynchronous change event trigger in Salesforce is go to the setup object, or go to the setup object, sure. Go to setup in Salesforce and type in change, not that, but change, and you'll see change data capture. And the first thing you're going to want to do is find whatever object it is that you want to put an asynchronous trigger on. Honestly, most objects you can use. There are a handful of objects, of standard objects, that you can't, unfortunately. But the vast majority of the ones that you would care about are here, and you can put any custom object, I believe, as well. So you'll find your entity, you'll select it, put it over here, and then hit the save button. I've already got the account object all set up for this demo, so yeah. Then once you have your entity selected and you've saved, then you'll come over to wherever you write your code, and I'm going to do this in IntelliJ because it's got better autocomplete than Visual Studio Code. I'm sorry, guys. If you don't like Illuminated Cloud, I apologize, but for this one video, I'm going to use it because I don't quite have everything memorized for change event triggers. Okay, so there's a handful of things you need to be aware of when you create a change event trigger. As you can see, it looks just like a normal trigger for the most part. One thing I want to state before we get into this. Number one, if you don't know what this IDE is, IntelliJ and Illuminated Cloud, I've got a video going over it. You can check it out. Number two, you should never build triggers like this. You should use a trigger framework, even for these asynchronous triggers. If you don't know what a trigger framework is or how to implement one, I've also got a video over that. Please go check it out if you're interested. Okay, so now that we've gone over that, and you're just going to please for the moment ignore that my trigger is not built the way that you should build it, let me go over what this change event trigger, what you can do with a change event trigger. So, as you can see here, this is mostly a normal trigger. The difference is, instead of this being on the account object, this is on the account change event object. And if this was a custom object, theoretically, then this would be custom object __ change event, like that. So that's the first thing that's a little different. You have to append your object with the words change event, because what you're going to get returned to you is not a bunch of accounts. You're going to get account change events returned to you, which are quite a bit different. And then the other thing that you need to be aware of is this will only operate on after insert. And that's really fine. You wouldn't really want to trigger on these change event objects for anything other than after insert. So this is the only thing you can do. You can't do before insert or really anything else, I don't believe. You can really only do after insert. So, okay, good, cool. Now that we've gone over that. The next thing that's important to know is that pretty much everything that you're going to find that's useful comes from the change event header for these asynchronous change event records, basically, that you get. So, I've kind of got a little example here. Basically, you're going to get a list of account change events or whatever, custom object change events or whatever object you're using. And you're going to want to make a variable that is these event bus change event headers. So these account change events that come through here have these change event headers appended to them, and they really hold a lot of information in them. So for instance, you can see that I've got this account change event header set to this object here, this ace header object. And what this is going to allow me to do is basically gather the vast majority of useful information that you can get from this. So for instance, if I wanted all of the account IDs that had recently changed, the change event header that comes through has that information. So as you can see, I can say account change event header dot get record IDs, and that will give me a list of all of the record IDs that have changed in that transaction. The other things you can do are, you can grab things like the change type. So if this was an update action, or if this was an insert action, or an undelete, or a delete, this will tell you that. So you can kind of, I guess, in your code, segregate your operations based on what the change type was. There's also a handful of other useful things. So these commit numbers, commit timestamps, commit user is very useful. The commit user is the actual user that did the commit. So like I said earlier, unfortunately, on the records for like the last modified by fields or created by fields, they're going to be set to the automated user in Salesforce. But you can grab that commit user and you can make them the owner of those records. You could fill out another field that's similar to like last modified date and put that commit user ID in it. So there are ways around that, in a sense. There's also a handful of other things. So you can just grab the the list of fields that have recently changed or have changed in this transaction rather. You can grab the entity name. The entity name is the object that you're that had this operation done on it. For the most part, you can probably guess that, but it's at least there for you in the header. This nulled fields list that you can get returned to you is literally just a list of fields that did have a value and then now don't have a value. So, you can easily get a list of those pretty quick. Record IDs, like we just talked about, is a list of all the record IDs. Transaction key is literally a unique transaction key that gets generated for these. You can also get the changed fields among a handful of other things that are very useful. So that's the major difference between a normal trigger and these asynchronous ones that you can create, these change event ones you can create, is that you're really operating, at least initially, with these event bus change event header objects and pulling out this information that you need so that you can assign it to whatever record it is you're creating, or you're gonna make. So for instance, if I was making a bunch of tasks on the account object, on an account record, every time we created an account, we'd pull out those record IDs. We'd probably pull out the commit user. That would be useful. So I do git commit user, and assign that to a string user ID, among other things. And then I'd use this information that I grabbed here from my change event and set up my task. So that's really the only major difference, aside from the many other things that I told you about with the asynchronous processing for this trigger, and the fact that it is an asynchronous trigger that operates in tandem with the other stuff that could be happening in your system instead of waiting for everything to complete. Honestly, guys, I think that's mostly it. I can show you one more thing, though. I was doing some experimenting with this a while back. I actually didn't really make this anytime recently. I did some experimentation with the change event triggers in the past. One thing I want to point out is that when I was doing this experimentation, I had an account trigger, and I had a change event trigger. And like I said before, the account trigger, it operates in batches of 200 always. And the change event trigger, it operates in batches of 2,000. I kind of thought that when the account trigger was done with a batch of 200, that as long as you had another account, as the same object trigger on here, that this would come over here and just do this change event trigger would get invoked with only that batch of 200. That's actually not true, interestingly enough. In fact, I have found no consistent pattern for it. So say you insert 1,000 records at the same time. It's possible that you get 1,000 records picked up here. I've seen that, where all 1,000 records get done with the normal process, and then the change event trigger picks up all 1,000 of them at the same time and processes them. But that's not always true. I would say that's only true maybe 30 to 40% of the time. A lot of times what I see is it just randomly decides to fire in the middle of that, batch of 1,000 that I'm doing, and I'll get a change event trigger with like 375 records in it. And then I'll get another change event trigger with 212 records in it, or something like that. So if you're thinking there's maybe like some consistency to it, if you have triggers firing beforehand, or if this batches it in some really consistent way, it doesn't. There's really no way to tell how many you're going to get in here, or when, or why it chunks them in the chunks that it does. At least I couldn't find a consistent pattern when I was doing stuff with it. Yeah. So I did want to point that out because I thought that was interesting. I was doing quite a bit of experimentation with this to see if I could use it with something, and I had to opt for another direction because there was just too many drawbacks to it. Okay, guys. So change event triggers. You can use them in a couple of theoretically good scenarios. I personally would really think hard about using them before you do. I've asked a handful of people whether or not I'm crazy for not liking them, and most of them seem to agree and or at least not preferring them initially unless I get desperate or something. And I think if you look on Stack Overflow, users tend to agree for the most part there too. Anyway, no matter what, we've covered asynchronous triggers. They're very easy to set up. They're very easy to utilize if you wanted to, but really think about everything before you go that direction. That's it for this video. I'm sorry I couldn't have been more positive about this one or about this asynchronous change event trigger. I would love to be, but I guess it's good that this video is out there to deter people from going this route, except in extreme cases. Or, maybe everybody will hate it and tell me I should have known something I didn't, which will also be good because then I'll learn something new. Anyway, thanks a bunch, guys, for watching these videos. If you want if you want more Salesforce videos, make sure to subscribe. I do one at least once a week. And yeah, that's it. See you guys next time.